instilling his dog in like 2 weeks. I'm taking her on a hike.
Oh, really?
And I asked him the other day, I said, do you mind if I like take her on a hike? She's like, as long as she
Hi, Elizabeth.
Hi, can you hear me?
Hi, yeah, I can hear you now. So I am going to pass the presenter rights to you so you can share your slides that way.
Okay. And can you hear me very well, or should I call in separately on my phone?
You sound really clear to us.
Okay. Okay, good.
So you should be getting a notification that you've been made a host. And then on your screen, there should be, there's a little pink screen that says share screen. And that's how you should be able to share your slides. I think it'd be easier for you to share your slides with us since you know the how long you're going to be on each one. But if there is any technical difficulties, I'm happy to take over.
Okay, here we go. Can you see it?
Yes.
Success.
Perfect. Great. So I'm just going to go on mute while we wait for, we have about 6 minutes before we get started. So I'm going to allow some more participants to join in the next couple of minutes, and then we'll get started.
All right, sounds good.
Okay, so I think we're going to get started now. CAMTech is excited to welcome Elizabeth Johansen to do a webinar on human-centered design for global health. Elizabeth is the principal of Spark Health Design Consultancy, Adjunct Faculty at Olin College of Engineering's Affordable Design and Entrepreneurship program, and Senior Advisor to Design That Matters. Elizabeth uses human-centered design to develop world-class technologies that lead to better health outcomes. With that, I'm going to pass it over to you, Elizabeth.
All right. Hello, everybody. So Alexis gave you a little bit of my background. Essentially, I'm an independent consultant these days, but I've worked with a variety of nonprofits and for-profits over the last decade around different healthcare technologies for global health. And I've been both an internal employee and a consultant for some of those engagements. I'll give you just a little bit more of my background and then talk about what we'll do today. So I started my career originally at IDEO, which is a design consultancy focused really on putting the user first and deriving insights from the user in order to create great designs. These days, IDEO designs physical products, but also services, experiences, business strategies, and so forth, using this sort of user insight. This is an example of a set of products that I worked on at the time, and just to give you a little of my history. So I used to work on a number of insulin injectors to help people manage their diabetes. I also worked on packaging for over-the-counter medication, and I even worked on a modular storage system for Target. And so it gives you kind of a broad perspective on some of the things that I worked on in the original background. As I was at IDEO, I started to become more and more interested in how some of the tools we used at IDEO to uncover user insights could be applied specifically towards positive social impact. And in particular, healthcare has always been of interest. And so this is what I've been doing over about the last 7 years. So I spent some time at nonprofit Design That Matters and also a nonprofit called Diagnostics for All. And in one case, we were creating devices for newborn care in low-resource hospitals in lower middle-income countries. In the other case, I was leading a project around and again with Design That Matters and also with a company called Jana Care. We've been working on more newborn healthcare equipment, and with Jana Care, rapid diagnostic test experiences for chronic disease and tools such as apps and online tools in order to help manage chronic disease such as diabetes and heart failure. So that's a little bit of my background. I think that there is a function in Zoom conference where you can raise your hand, and I can see the list of participants currently. If you can find that function, we'll try this out here. Anyone who currently works in some kind of a global health or healthcare field, could you raise your hand digitally? Cool, so I see 4 hands raised. I'm gonna lower the hands. Another question for you, how many people on the call are familiar with human-centered design, like have heard of it before? Okay, so we've got about half. Very cool. Okay, that gives me a little bit of an idea of your backgrounds. I'll go to the next slide. So what I wanted to talk to you a little bit about today is the application of human-centered design to designing technology for global health. And, you know, first, of course, it's great to talk about the need. So why in global health? And so you can just see, even from this picture, which is actually from Stephen Rudy of Gradient Health Systems, this is a picture of a typical medical equipment junkyard in an LMIC. And the reason why there are a lot of these junkyards is because there's a lot of equipment sent abroad that is technically designed more for an industrialized nation, with amenities such as a smooth power source, smooth floors, air conditioning, filtered air, staff that have different levels of training and so forth. And so a lot of the equipment that's currently sent abroad, either purchased or donated, ends up in these medical equipment junkyards. So the WHO, the World Health Organization, has written a number of phenomenal publications about just this issue. One of them is Medical Devices Managing the Mismatch, and I highly recommend you read it. But just they recognize, almost all devices that are present in developing countries have been designed for use in industrialized countries. And up to about 3/4 of these devices do not function or remain unused. So either they're broken or they're never used in the first place, and they end up in the junkyard. And, a lot of this is due to when these devices are designed, the needs assessment doesn't include LMICs. So these sort of contexts and users and environments of use are not taken into account as part of the product requirements during the design. There's also, as I mentioned, the lack of robust infrastructure. There's a lack of spare parts to replace in certain devices when they break down. For instance, if the device has a light bulb that needs to be replaced from time to time, it's often hard to find that same specialty light bulb. Even in some cases where hospitals actually have the budget to purchase a replacement part, they'll call a large manufacturer, and the large manufacturer won't send it to them because they're not a registered hospital in their database. Especially consumables are a pain. So both in terms of having personnel that are on top of changing it. So even if you have the bulbs or the filters or whatever is needed, having enough personnel to keep on top of that is very difficult, and especially there can be rotating personnel. And then also getting information in the first place to the people who are procuring these devices so that they know what to procure. And similarly, there's often a lack of maintenance staff, people who are like biomedical engineers and are trained to troubleshoot and fix problems. And then finally, the trained healthcare staff, the level of training is very different. So a lot of the machines have a lot of extra settings and complexities that are difficult to bring people up to speed on. So, with this sort of backdrop, there's just a huge need. I hope you understand walking away from this call. There's a huge need for better and more appropriate medical devices that are designed specifically with LMICs in mind. So one of the expertises I have is around human-centered design, and the idea here is about starting with the people. So this could be patients that are going to benefit from a device. It could be also care providers. It could be healthcare workers who are going to be using certain devices. All of these sort of stakeholders to try and understand why a need isn't being met currently and how we could design something better to meet that whole list of stakeholder needs. And then from there, the idea is to move to is there a solution that could be feasible in terms of technology? So technology exists that would allow us to create a solution, and also, is there a viable business around it such that we know we could fund this? So these are some of the classic tools that I learned when I was back in my days at IDEO, and a lot of these tools are associated with another term called design thinking, so the ability to think like a designer. Some of these involve using visual thinking, inspiration from a variety of sources, being able to take a lot of information that you get from all these different stakeholders and synthesize it into something meaningful that shows an opportunity area and hints towards solutions. Brainstorming or idea generation, so being able to then go from what you've seen and observed to thinking of ideas for solutions, and then finally prototyping. So these are all classic tools used in design thinking that I've also been using in the pursuit of better tools for global health. In this talk, I wanted to focus on some very specific examples about how Design That Matters used prototyping, rapid prototyping, in order to arrive at a solution for a phototherapy device. So first, just a little, what's a prototype? So a lot of people, when you hear the word prototype, you often think of like a machine. So Merriam-Webster dictionary, notes that. So something physical, like a product, an early model of a product. The way that I'd love for you to leave the talk thinking about prototyping is that it's really anything that you create, anything tangible you create to help test some kind of assumption, a critical assumption that you need to test to ensure that you can get to the impact that you want to see. And I always love this quote from Denny Boyle, who's one of the earliest IDEOers. He says, never attend a meeting without a prototype. And so, and you'll see from some of the examples that also is pretty expansive. So whatever meeting it is, instead of just bringing an agenda or a set of talking points verbally, is there any way that you can embody your idea so that you can have a deeper conversation more efficiently and more quickly get to answers? That's what I'm talking about when I mention prototyping. And then why prototype in general? Why would you come to every meeting with some kind of a prototype? And the idea is to very quickly disprove or disprove your critical assumptions, because the cost of change just gets higher and higher over time. So if you're getting further and further into the development and launch of a technology and it's already out there, it's a lot harder to change it at that point. So if you discover something about it that doesn't work well, either it's not very usable or doesn't fit the business model or anything, it's a lot harder to change it at that point than to find that out earlier. So here's the example I'm going to use to tell you a little bit more about prototyping, experiences in prototyping. This is Project Firefly, which is a newborn phototherapy device initiative. This is a collaborative effort between Design That Matters, a nonprofit design firm, as well as MTTS, which is the manufacturer in Vietnam, and also an NGO called Thrive Networks, who at the time was providing a package of newborn care solution, including education, training, identification of hospital needs, as well as technology. So that's a little background. Sorry, we're flipping through these pretty fast. Okay, so what is phototherapy and why? So the challenge we are looking at is that 10% of all newborns worldwide need phototherapy in order to avoid potential brain damage or kernicterus or cerebral palsy-like effects or even death. And the reason the treatment of phototherapy is specifically for jaundice, which is an excess of bilirubin in the blood. And the treatment focuses on putting this 459 nanometer wavelength light on as much of the baby's skin as possible. And so initially you'd think, wow, that should be a solved problem. It's just a light and it is shine on the baby. But at the time, the state of the art was such that light bulbs, I've mentioned light bulbs before, light bulbs were burning out and were difficult to replace. It was often difficult to know when the light source had gotten dim enough that it wasn't effective anymore. And there were a host of machines in the field that would often break down due to the rugged environment. So either because they had been burnt out, because they had too much dust on them. And even then, when there was a perfectly well-working device, often it was used incorrectly and so didn't provide intensive phototherapy to newborns. So those were some of the challenges we were seeing at the time. What we realized the potential impact could be in focusing initially on Vietnam was that could we bring phototherapy, which could potentially be a very simple treatment, given that it's non-invasive, could we bring it to a district level hospital so people weren't needing to travel around the country or the state or the province in order to find phototherapy at a higher level hospital? The district level hospital is the closest kind of community hospital where they would keep newborns overnight potentially. So that was our kind of brief. And I'll show you a little bit how we use prototyping to tackle the challenge. So the first thing that we did was do what's called creating a theory of change. And so you saw the impact we were hoping to have. So we're hoping to provide phototherapy at a district level to be able to treat more newborns with jaundice before they've gotten severe, hopefully decrease mortality related to jaundice. And so our theory of change essentially stated how we believed we would potentially get to that state. And then between the theory of change, between each step, so the idea that we'd be creating a device, that we'd actually get it delivered, that they would actually use it, and then that there would actually be the outcome we thought, which is a decrease in mortality. Between each of those steps, there are assumptions. So assumptions like our manufacturer has the capacity and capabilities to use plastic parts because we believe plastic's necessary in the design, or our NGO partner Thrive Networks is going to be able to roll this out. It's going to fit with their program of education and training that they've been distributing throughout Vietnam. So there are a number of critical assumptions that we generated. And the reason I mentioned these two ideas, the theory of change and the assumptions, is that we then sort the assumptions in terms of which are the biggest wild gas and which would be the biggest catastrophe if they were falsified. So wild guess meaning we think this is true, but we really have very little information about it right now. And if it turned out to be wrong, it would really change the program a lot. So back to that graph of investment over time. So these post-its are the ones around which we want to prototype. And so essentially we designed our program and the way we spent our time and who we were talking to around figuring out whether these assumptions were true or false. Okay, so here are a couple of examples of prototypes we created and helping you also expand the notion of what is a prototype. So here's a pretty classic prototype you see here. This prototype was made by Design That Matters. We called it an alpha prototype. It used foam, it used some very rough buttons. It had light from the top and bottom, but it wasn't necessarily therapeutic intensity light. It was just sort of the fastest light we could find. And we took it to healthcare providers and hospitals in Vietnam and district hospitals, as well as other levels of hospitals. And we asked people to engage with it and say, where would you put it? How would you use it? And so in this case, this prototype, the function it filled was a tool for communication with some of the potential users. And the photo you see here is something we found out. They felt like they would want to drape the prototype in order to not have the light be in the nurse's eyes. They didn't want the light escaping out the side because it could often bother the nurse's eyes. And apparently this sheet is a typical thing they use to drape some of the other phototherapy lamps. So in this case, we discovered something critical that we didn't even know to ask. And in this case, the fact that the habit would be to drape the device. So we knew that the top light, we would need to make it robust enough to not over. It's a sketch on paper, sort of like the broadest notion of what a prototype is. In this case, I'm talking about the idea of prototyping as a tool for co-creation. And so this was a sheet that we sent out to for Thrive Networks to do at one of their jaundice conferences. So they were bringing 70 or 80 healthcare practitioners from around Vietnam to a conference to learn more about jaundice treatment and jaundice care. And so one of the stations that we set up in collaboration with them was to give people this survey and to ask them, can you please draw your ideal device? And a couple of the drawings came back this way, which showed, please have light from the top and the bottom. And so most of the lights currently on the market were just from the top and only getting one side of the newborn skin. But like we mentioned, the best treatment shines blue light on as much skin as possible. So here we were able to get feedback and get ideas directly from healthcare providers who are working in the field day in and day out. And they mentioned, top and bottom phototherapy could be really valuable. And here's another tool for co-creation. So, after that, we made this alpha prototype like you saw before. And one of the things we did is just make different sorts of buttons and icons that could be pasted on the outside. So we could ask, where should the buttons go? How do you want to interact with it? So by creating these prototypes, in this case, prototypes of buttons and prototypes of readouts, we were able to engage healthcare providers in conversations about how they wanted the device to be designed. The other really helpful thing about prototypes, especially in the situation here where we were, Design That Matters is an American firm speaking English and not speaking Vietnamese, and also being foreign to the culture and so forth. And the people we were speaking to through a translator provided by Thrive Networks. So having a prototype and seeing people physically interact with it cut through a lot of the burden of translation, simultaneous translation when we were trying to have a conversation together. And so it would help us see exactly what they wanted, which would have been actually hard to do if we were just having a conversation with no visuals. Here's another example of bringing something to every meeting. In the very early stages, before we had the alpha prototype with double-sided, we made these sort of concepts. These are called renderings, where we drew something up and created sort of a photo of the idea of the concept. So this is something we brought for conversations with our manufacturing partner, MTTS in Vietnam, and also Thrive Health, who would be hopefully distributing the machine after MTTS manufactured it. And the idea here was very quickly, without too much effort, because it was just drawings and not actually building things, let's discuss what's required around phototherapy. And from this discussion, it became really obvious that the one in the middle, shade, was the best. And our partners also brought up that they had been hearing about double-sided phototherapy. And so they felt that something like the middle concept, but with phototherapy also from the bottom, could be one of the most powerful. This allowed us to explore ideas early and ensure that we knew what our partners' experience had been and ensure that we were going in the right direction. And then another example of a prototype that helped us align with our partners, this was a spreadsheet. So in this case, this was a prototype of how much the device will cost. And a lot of this was around very tough question of how many units they would be able to produce, how many devices they would be able to produce in year 1, year 2, and so forth. So Thrive Networks knew that the global health market is very unpredictable. A lot of the equipment sales are based on a cycle of different sorts of funding, like USAID funding or other donor funding, which is sort of unpredictable, and it's unsure when it's going to come and unsure what quantity of devices are going to come. And so in this spreadsheet, we talked through the impact of volume on the cost of a device. And just a little background in terms of medical devices. When you're making a physical medical device, the cost of the different parts is less per piece if you can make a lot. So I could go to, if I'm making a metal part, I could go to a certain vendor, and if I'm asking for 1,000 of that metal part, they may say, okay, each metal part's only $10. But if I'm asking only for 100, they may say that each part's actually going to have to cost $40. And some of the reason is that there's usually a tool and a setup and other things in order to get ready to make it. And the cost of the personnel and the cost of the tooling is a very big part of the per piece cost. So this allowed us to have a very tough conversation early with our partners to better understand what the price of the final device could be. And then this is another prototype. In this case, we were mocking up essentially like a tenders process. So hospitals, a lot of hospitals and also a lot of governments purchase medical devices by issuing a request for proposal, which is called a tender. And so hospitals say, well, we need 5 phototherapy devices and 3 CPAP devices and so on and so forth. And then different manufacturers will answer the tender with their devices and their pricing, and then they'll decide which one they're going to choose. So in this case, we were curious on given the design of Firefly as it got into the final stages, like you can see up top, given the design, the aesthetics, the function, and so forth, how would it be valued compared to other phototherapy options? And in this case, we included a prior prototype that MTTS had made called the Billy Bed on the bottom. We also include an MTTS product called an overhead that was just an overhead only, not top and bottom. We also included a hospital-made top and bottom phototherapy that had been found in South Vietnam. And we just asked them to rank, like, which do you think would probably be the most expensive or the least expensive? And the really interesting thing is that Firefly came out on top. And a lot of the conversations early about this revealed something kind of counterintuitive, but it made sense in the end. Being able to show a really first-class medical aesthetic in the design, which we accomplished by using some plastic parts, which MTTS previously hadn't had capability to produce, and engaging an industrial designer to make a really phenomenal form factor as well as color treatment, and the robust design of it, making it so very user-friendly and so forth, made it come out on top, even though an MTTS overhead, for instance, could treat 3 babies at a time instead of 1. And so being able just to do this quick exercise with photos and trying to understand value helped us predict whether we would be able to put out the device given the cost. You know, would it be valued as a top-end phototherapy device or not? And not, it was. And then another example of a prototype, the idea of a prototype here is just investigating ideas really inexpensively. So when we were first considering a top and bottom light and figuring out what will be the structure to hold the top and bottom light, our industrial designer, Will Harris, used some really simple metal kind of bendable metal tubing to create a bunch of different versions, miniature versions of how the device could work architecturally. The great thing about this tool is that it mimicked what the final material would be. So he was considering a literal metal tube and how it could be bent in order to create a structure. And so this smaller and much less expensive version helped him figure out more quickly which way would work. And then this is another one. This is a tool that we used in talking to a lot of healthcare providers in hospitals in Vietnam. This one was to show a set of different phototherapy devices and have a set of flashcards asking what were the qualities of the medical device and which devices did them the best. So things like comforting for the newborn, easy to access for providing other treatments to the newborn, newborn is visible enough, newborn's warm enough, very intensive treatment, those sorts of things are the cards below. And again, this type of a prototype or a physical asset helped us have conversations that would have been hard in simultaneous translation, but we could see where they were sorting the different cards, and the cards had both Vietnamese and English on them, so we could tell that they were mentioning that one device was, you know, more cleanable than another, and then we were able to have a lot of in-depth conversations from there. And then this section's a little bit about how to prototype, but it includes also examples from this project. One of the ways is to always break the problem into pieces. So one example was, how big is this device going to need to be overall just to have a big enough light area to treat a large-sized newborn? And so instead of doing a complex model on the computer or creating the entire device, we created these foam models, which then had a blue area just made in tape to show where the blue light would be coming from. And this model showed how big the surrounding device would need to be to incorporate all the electronics that we needed. Then we were able to take this model and carry it around and see if it was still small enough that someone could easily, like a small person, could easily pick it up and move it from room to room. This is more example about breaking the problem into pieces. So on the left, we talked a lot about this alpha prototype, which wasn't a totally effective device yet, but kind of showed the direction we wanted to take it with the top and bottom light. This one, you know, as I mentioned, it wasn't effective phototherapy. It was just kind of putting any blue lights in there and then getting a conversation going with healthcare providers. But in the middle, we did our works like prototype. So this is more of the engineering prototype. So it was made of wood, and the actual bassinet didn't look comfortable for a baby. It was just a rectangular box. But the idea here is that it was all the shapes and materials and so forth that would let us test whether the lights were bright enough. That's our works like prototype. And then there's yet another one that's called a feels like prototype. So for example, we wanted people to be able to grab the device, hold it, and carry it. And so having that finger grip area feel comfortable and be kind of ergonomic, we wanted to explore that quickly and cheaply. And so you can see on the bottom right, we took a bunch of white foam and cut it up and made a finger grip type of shape that different size hands could rest their hand on and indicate which was the most comfortable. And then that shape was then integrated into the bottom of the device. And this is another example of sort of a prototype. In this case, we're creating a storyboard and thinking through all the steps. So sometimes it's can be easy to start the design of a particular technology without thinking through all the use cases and exactly how it's going to be used. And so this is a tool for thinking through quickly without having to make the full design. So in this case, we knew that, you know, one of the steps was the treatment. So even within treatment, we'd say, press the button to turn on the lights, and then we'd also show what was displayed on the display. So here it shows, first it's going to show how many hours it was used total over life for several seconds, and then it would start counting up from 0 to show how long the light had been on. So this was part of a larger poster that showed every bit. So adding the eye cover to protect them, placing the bassinet on the device, and all the way back down to removal. And this is really helpful in making sure that our user interface included everything, all the information that needed to be displayed and all the buttons and controls that were required. And then this is another example, a more advanced version of thinking through all the steps. So eventually that became a diagram that showed how the electronics should work. So if the machine was in different states, yes or no, it would display different things. So this was a great tool to communicate, in this case, with our engineering partners who were designing it. So we could look through this and you know, make sure we were both clear on what they needed to design, and they would then understand what are the requirements of the circuit and so forth. And then another how on prototyping, the idea is make it quick and dirty. So back to that theme of just really inexpensively finding out, testing a critical assumption early. So in this case, we were curious, how big did the little bed need to be to fit the largest size newborn? So instead of making the final bed, which is on the left, the clear bed, which takes a lot of machining and tooling and so on and so forth, first we made a bed out of foam, the white bed that appears on the right. And so this is something we could make very inexpensively and quickly, and then we would get an image of whether this is too big, too high, too long, whether it would fit in the device and so forth. And also on that idea of quick and dirty, this is another type of prototype, but like you saw before, you know, you can prototype a physical device, and you've seen a lot of examples of that, but you can also prototype a plan. In this case, this was our Design That Matters plan on how we believe we'd go through the various phases until we could launch and get Firefly out in the world and having impact. So this included all sorts of steps, including, you know, agreements between us and partners, project schedule estimates, and so forth. And by creating this plan in more of a post-its and prototyping sort of manner, it helped to updated. But then keeping it in this sort of prototype form helps you feel like you're able to recognize when you're off the plan, and you're able to update the plan accordingly. And then another how kind of tip is use role playing. Something we did a lot with the physical devices was ask some of the nurses to interact with them in the ways that they would interact with them once it became a final product. So in this case, this nurse was very lovely enough to pick up the alpha prototype and carry it around the hospital to simulate what it would be like to move the device from one room to another. And one of the things we really were hoping for is to ensure that the device is easy to move, especially from a top floor to a bottom floor, because we know a lot of the hospitals we're designing for didn't necessarily have an elevator, and a lot of the equipment, like the large equipment that would just be on wheels, would get stuck in one place or another. So this was a great way to early on to discover whether it was ergonomic enough for her to carry. And then this is another example, you know, how close could it be to mom and still be comfortable? And so this mother was good enough to let us put the prototype next to her, and she gave us some of her observations. And some of the ideas that came up actually from this exploration were that she really appreciated the idea of having the newborn next to her instead of in the ICU in another room. especially because she was going to be breastfeeding. She could also look after the newborn. And through some of this interaction, we realized that it could be particularly beneficial for district hospitals to have this device be small and potentially fit on a bed or a table in the mom's room, because they don't have as many staff to watch over babies that might be in a separate ICU room. So this was a great way to ensure that at least mom was watching over the baby, and if something dramatic was going wrong, then mom would be able to raise the flag and hopefully find a healthcare provider to help out. And then iterate, iterate, iterate. So you can see all sorts of iterations here for the Firefly prototype. So on the right, an early student concept that shows the upper light, in the middle the alpha prototype, and on the left the final product that was launched. And a lot of other little bits and pieces below in the shelves that helped us slowly come to the final product. But then similarly iterate, iterate, iterate on the plan. And so here's our various prototype versions of sort of the plan and how we were hoping to reach this positive impact. So in the end, a lot of these prototyping methods, among other things, helped us get great partner alignment to ensure that we could pass this technology over to the manufacturer and they would be able to manufacture it, and then they would also stay true to the vision of the product. So really pretty unprecedented thing happened, which was the prototype that we created, which you saw in the previous version in the shelf, and the final product, which you see in this picture, ended up looking exactly the same because we worked so closely with our partners and because we were able to use a lot of prototyping to make sure our critical assumptions were proven false early and that we got on the right page with each other. Similarly, the device worked, and so a lot of healthcare providers and moms have been able to have their newborns benefit from the device. At this point, our estimates are that over 100,000 newborns have been treated in the last several years, and the device is now in 23 different developing countries across Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean. It's a CE mark device, so it can go, it makes it easier for it to go into a lot of new countries. So that's a little bit around that project. And, talking about afterwards, the company, the MTTS that we were working with in Vietnam to manufacture Firefly, through all of this collaboration and, seeing methods like prototyping and other things for engaging users, they launched a new family of newborn care devices inspired by Firefly's design. So that includes a new overhead phototherapy device, a new CPAP device for respiratory distress, and they used a lot of the same techniques that we had used together for Firefly in order to design these. So really excited that the impact stretched beyond just the impact of the one device. So that's a little bit of history of Firefly and specific look into the technique of prototyping. And I would love to take any questions or have any discussion with you.
I'm just going to ask for questions. If you could type them into the chat function instead of the Q&A, it's a little bit easier for everyone to see. Thank you.
All right. So Chris Olson is asking, any opportunities to get post-marketing feedback, and what were some of the surprises? So yeah, there have been opportunities. So I've continued to work with Design That Matters as an advisor, and through the Affordable Design Entrepreneurship program at Olin, we've been doing a newborn warmer project with the same set of partners. And so it's been great because I've personally been able to go back to a lot of hospitals that have been using Firefly and see what the real use has been. But then we've also been in touch very closely with our partners who did a number of different studies and collected various feedback. One of the biggest surprises when we launched Firefly Phototherapy was that because it's so effective, it turned out to be a much faster treatment time. It makes sense, like hindsight 2020, but it wasn't necessarily one of the original goals of the project. When we created top and bottom lighting, we were really going for making it simple and making it hard to use wrong, quote unquote. So we often saw that a mom might put a blanket over the baby to keep them warm, but then the overhead phototherapy was no longer providing treatment because the blanket was blocking it. So what the idea here of top and bottom is that even if someone put a blanket under or maybe over, they're still getting effective treatment from one side. The surprise is that the treatment actually goes twice as fast. And in a lot of the hospitals that had been using underperforming phototherapy or been using good phototherapy but incorrectly, one of the new effects on the body is that when you have a lot of bilirubin byproduct coming out, it comes out through urine and stool, and your stool turns green. And so for a lot of people, for a lot of hospitals, this was the first time that they'd used a very effective device and that the bilirubin had been taken out of the blood very quickly. And so they were seeing babies for the first time with this very, very green poop, and they had never seen that before because they hadn't been using effective phototherapy. So there was sort of an education campaign that Thrive Networks had to take on, in addition to just training in the use of the device, to say, you know, the green poop that you're seeing is normal. That's a sign that the bilirubin is coming out very quickly, which is good. You don't need to be worried that, you know, the green poop is a sign of hurting the baby. That's just one example. Thanks, Alicia. So Alicia's asked, how do you navigate the regulatory restrictions across geographies when developing these products? So in the realm of these sort of durable medical devices, one of the main things we've come to conclusion, and many of the other companies working in our same space came to the same conclusion, CE mark tends to be very worth your while. So, you know, in the United States, most devices need an FDA approval, but for nearly everywhere else in the world, CE mark approval is accepted, and CE mark was sort of the European approval, so to speak. So we found that being able to go through CE mark approval makes the most sense. When we licensed our product over to MTTS, the Vietnamese manufacturer, is the one who did all of that effort to go through the CE mark approval process. And what it essentially does is it enables you to create all the documentation that shows that the device is safe and was designed in a good way and kept the context of use in mind and so forth. You now have that documentation. As you approach each new country, you do usually need to register the medical device, so there's still some kind of level of an approval, and different countries can have different requirements around that and even shifting requirements around that. But overall, if you've gone through CE mark, you're more likely to be able to quickly get approved in a new country, and you're more likely to have all the paperwork and reports generated that the country would like to see to ensure that it's a good medical device. And I see Olga's asked a question. On the regulation side, did it affect the design process and the product design? Was it hard to get the medical device approved? And as Design That Matters is a US-based company, and the project was in Vietnam, what did that mean for the regulatory approval side of things? So a little, let's see, what can I say? Regulatory approval. So one of the great things about the medical device industry that's different than other industries, like, for instance, solar lighting or latrines and so forth, may not have the same level of regulation as a medical device, but the great flip side of that is that there's a lot of documentation around what makes an effective medical device for different types of devices. So because of FDA approval and CE mark approval, there are these ISO and IEC standards that have been created that say what could make, so for instance, for phototherapy, what are the characteristics and requirements of an effective phototherapy device? So something we walked into, given phototherapy was already known and proven as a therapy, we were able to get this phototherapy standard, which gave us information like how even does the light need to be in order to be effective? How bright does it need to be? How would you measure that to ensure that it's going to do a good job? All of that had already been created in the form of these standards. So one of the great things about regulation is that it's led to these standards, which can lead to, in some senses, like a recipe book, quote unquote, for success. The things that the standards lack are requirements that would make these devices work well in an LMIC context. So just meeting these standards doesn't mean it will work well in a low-resource hospital in Vietnam or in Ghana, etc., because the standards don't include requirements such as working with intermittent electrical power or working even when there's a lot of dust and bugs and so forth. And so what you need to do with, what you can do with human-centered design is discover those additional requirements and add those to your list. That's a little bit about like how regulation affected the design process itself. So we both referred to existing standards that we would need to meet, and we used human-centered design to get additional product requirements to make sure it would work in the environment that's, you know, different than the standards were really created for. And then in terms of getting it approved, there's a pretty robust infrastructure around getting CE mark approval, that kind of European approval. And most all of that was handled by MTTS in Vietnam. So Design That Matters designed it and got all the way to a prototype that looks like what you see in the picture here. So we made 3 devices that we could use in a clinical evaluation. Then we transferred all of the technology and drawings and instructions on how to build it to MTTS, and they did a bunch of tweaks to make it even better for CE mark regulatory purposes. And then they made the product. So they went through the actual final regulatory approval process. Any other questions about anything? Could be about Firefly or human-centered design or anything. So Frank is asking, does committing to human-centered design alter the business plan? Definitely, you know, going back to my roots at IDEO and those 3 circles, maybe we can go back up to those. Or not, because it's frozen. So if we went back up here to the 3 circles, there are successful businesses that start with the business model, for instance. So they realize, wow, money could be made by doing XYZ, and they start to, you know, raise funding and get momentum around. They definitely changes the business. I guess in the cases of businesses like that, or businesses that start with technology, so that's classic, like if you look at research laboratories who are discovering entire new technologies, a lot of times they're discovering new physical properties or chemical properties, and then later they're saying, you know, what could we do with this new discovery? And at that point, they go to figure out if they could make a business of it, or to see, you know, what's desirable about it. So both of those cases exist, and working with groups who kind of have that as the core, like either the business part is sort of the core of what they're doing, or it started with the technology. A lot of times inserting the human part is tougher, and it really depends. So like there are a number of, this is like such a rife question, but there are a number of industries where, you know, science and technology, that development takes a long time. And so the piece where you're actually interacting with users is always going to be pretty small. And sometimes I'll find in those industries, it's harder to insert it at all. It's easy to just kind of skip that moment where you're talking to users. And it's easy to then come out with technologies that are not well suited to users or don't have the kind of adoption that could exist. There are other technologies, though, where you really only need kind of it's a Me Too technology. There's already a lot known about how people use it and what's challenging because of prior technologies on the market. And really the focus is to quickly iterate and put a new version of it out with some minor changes. And in that case, using a lot of human-centered design or a lot of user observations and interviews isn't as necessary. The companies I love to work with the most are those that are using human-centered design to really reimagine the way we deliver healthcare. And so within global health, it's really exciting to use human-centered design as the core to envision just radically simpler designs, things like medical technology that don't need to have so many options, so many menus, so many displays, so many buttons. How can we really simplify it for everybody? That's one of the themes I'm really excited about. And you can also look to other companies, even beyond the global health realm, such as PillPack. PillPack's another example of like a human-centered design-centered company, and they really are changing sort of the pharmacy business. So they're really thinking about what's the experience for the person more so than what are all the steps or physical objects that are involved. All of those technologies are only there to satisfy the user in getting their pharmaceutical prescriptions more easily and correctly and effectively. Or there's another company called Omada. They're another very human-centered design-led company. They essentially said, wow, diabetes prevention is possible. There's a lot of studies showing how that can be done and how behavior change can take place. We're going to use human-centered design to really deeply understand people struggling with diabetes, and then we're going to respond with a technology and a business model that can help support them in making changes like increased activity or changes in how many calories they eat in a day and so forth, things that can really affect diabetes. So those are, technologies, or I guess companies can exist that have any of these as the center. And, I get particularly excited about the human-centered design-centered companies and the way that they can help re-envision technology in such a way that it's, moving humankind forward, that we're providing better experiences and we're all getting healthier as we go. So Sayali asks the question, how can we make human-centered design more eco-friendly such that it doesn't generate a lot of industrial waste? And for instance, like material selection as an example during product design. So one of the things we found in the Firefly process, there were aspects around human-centered design that take like a systems perspective that ended up leading to a better kind of energy-friendly design for Firefly as well. So Firefly ended up being better in multiple ways, even though at the beginning we didn't really state specifically the kind of green side of it as being one of our goals. So through interviewing so many stakeholders, through seeing all the equipment graveyards, through seeing the way that technology would be sent to an LMIC and then not used or broken quickly, that we realized was just an incredible waste. Not only is it leading to a junkyard full of plastic that can't be disposed of, sitting outside of hospitals, it's leading to newborns not getting treatment and dying. And so all of those things were really linked in our minds. And part of that was because the human-centered design really emphasized that systems perspective, like interviewing all the different stakeholders who might be affected in order to figure out and imagine new solutions. So some of the places where Firefly succeeded on the eco end, in this case, were that first of all that it's more robust, and so it's not likely to break and end up in the graveyard. And it's a lot easier to use, so it's more likely to be adopted and continue to be used even as personnel change over in a hospital. So even just that, we realized, for this project, creating something that's going to actually be used instead of immediately going to a junkyard was a massive benefit in terms of the environment. The other thing that we realize is that in LMICs, electricity, the cost of electricity is something that healthcare providers think about, especially some of the places where electricity is on and off, where they have to use a generator with expensive fuel. Electricity is a big one. So for instance, we saw behavior through human-centered design that if the healthcare workers were given an option of multiple settings in phototherapy, they'd often put the lowest setting on because they didn't want to use too much electricity, and they also wanted to make the bulbs last as long as possible. So, we realized with Firefly, there was an advent of a technology which is a very high-powered LED, which used less power than any of the other lights sources that had been out there previously that people were used to for phototherapy. And so there's this sort of confluence of things that we could do with this technology at the same time. So because it was high power, but it didn't use much electricity, we could say, you know what, we're not going to have settings on our device. We're only going to have intensive high power all the time. And not only that, this intensive high power two-sided phototherapy is actually going to take 1/10 of the electricity of most of the other devices currently on the market. So it's going to be like a win-win for you. You're going to be able to use it more correctly and provide a more intensive, correct treatment to a newborn, and you're going to save on electricity at the same time. So that's sort of an anecdote of how human-centered design ended up connected to eco-friendly for us. It ended up being less about, like, material selection, I think, comes to mind first when thinking about eco-friendly. In this particular circumstance, by looking at it through human-centered design, we realized the main opportunities were making sure it gets used so that the energy that's been put into making it actually leads to saving human lives instead of going to the junkyard, and then also that there was technology that could enable a win-win of better use and also lower electricity use.
So I think we're just about out of time. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. This has been an incredibly informative webinar, and we have recorded it for anyone that's was on the webinar or on the call and wasn't able to see Elizabeth's slides. And we'll be posting that to the CAMTech Innovation Platform. So look out for that. And thank you again, Elizabeth.
Awesome. It was great to talk with all of you today. Thank you for your great questions.
Great. All right. Thanks, everyone.